Hello everyone. I'm making this video because I want to help try to teach everybody what I know. Today I want to talk to you about Narcissistic Personality Disorder, or NPD for short. I picked this topic because honestly I feel that there's a general low understanding of what it truly is and how it can be devastating and destructive to the family and those around them. I want to discuss stuff like the effects, and we'll cover issues like what is narcissistic abuse and the effects it can have. It's important to understand all these different tactics that they use. They can result in very real and very damaging consequences. So to begin off, what is narcissistic personality? Narcissistic personality is characterized by selfishness, self-esteem problems, and fragile egos, for examples, which can result in an extreme reaction to criticism. They're highly manipulative to people who are skilled in deception. And then since they have a deep fear of being helpless or powerless, they tend to be very controlling. They're also characterized by an exaggerated sense of self-importance, which leads to a distorted view of their own ability and accomplishment. In the public eye, they have to be seen as a good person. They care a lot about their self-imagery. So they tend to build themselves up by bragging and boasting about their accomplishments, even when there is no real evidence of these accomplishments, and is going as far as lying to make themselves look better to people. Last characteristics I would like to emphasize is the lack of empathy for others, which leads them to be unable to understand or appreciate other people's perspectives or opinions. This lack of caring allows them to exhibit no remorse for exploiting or hurting others. They simply do not understand how their words or actions affect another person. But maybe then, again, maybe they do. Since they won't accept any responsibility for the damage they cause, when somebody points it out to them, they tend to avoid conflict to keep them from being exposed for who they are. When cornered with unescapable evidence, they desperately go into damage control. They quickly become vindictive, and you will soon be faced with an entirely different person. The person you thought loved you is now only interested in self-preservation, trying to cover their tracks, and making everything your fault. Be warned. You will not know and expect what's about to hit you. So bear with me. There's got to be a lot to cover in hopes to give you some sort of the nightmare that is to come. So I'll start off by explaining what narcissistic abuse is. And please, thank you for being patient with me. This is the first time I've given this speech. Okay, so with people with narcissistic personalities, you got to realize they're masters of disguise. And narcissistic abuse is a form of thought control. They skillfully use tactics designed to emotionally manipulate a person into handing over their mind and their will, and they do this for their own personal gain. So what is narcissistic abuse? It's a destructive defense mechanism that destroys relationship and causes pain and damage to loved ones. They then further damage by claiming you're the one who's causing it. This is called blame shifting. The person with narcissistic personality will try to isolate their victims. They'll lie and use other forms of manipulations to further control and silence the victim by taking away their support system by using stuff like slander. In short, narcissistic abuse is meant to get their victim to question their sanity, to mistrust those who support them like family and friends, feel abandoned and hopeless, instill feelings of worthlessness, create doubt in their victim's ability to think and to make decisions. It tries to disconnect the victim from their own needs and wants, and it devalues the victim in all possible ways. So now that we have an idea of what narcissistic abuse is, I'm going to go over a list of tactics and try to explain how they do this to people. One of the first terms that you should probably get familiarized with is gaslighting. These are statements designed to make people question their reality and underplay and downplay people in order to diminish their worth or mislead people from the truth, such as using misinformation like moving an object or telling a person that, and then telling the person they misplaced it in hopes to try to make them feel crazy. So, short explanation. There's projection. When a person with narcissistic personality are unwilling to see their own shortcomings, they will often avoid their own accountability by projecting or displacing that responsibility and attributing it to somebody else. Instead of admitting they need their own self-improvement, they'll take their own toxic shame about themselves and place it onto others. An example of this would be claiming a partner of not being intimate, despite that actually being the reality. Remember, narcissists lack empathy and often tend to be less affectionate after the love bombing phase. Sorry, I won't be covering love bombing and other sort of phases. So, move on to the next one. They move the goalpost. Even when given all the evidence in the world to validate your argument or take actions to meet all their expectations of you, they'll set a new goal or make the current goal unavailable by setting new expectations or rules. They may even lie and say they never even intended to agree to something once you met the requirements. Nitpicking and scapegoating. They will use anything they can against you, true or false, to keep you down and to get their way. They often use these kind of tactics to scapegoat their own behavior by turning the spotlight on you so they can try to escape the credibility of their own harmful behaviors. Rerouting the subject. When faced with evidence or confronted about their behaviors, they will try to change the subject. They tend to use their own personal flaws, or they tend to use your own, another person's flaws, in order to keep them from being exposed and the spotlight off of them. Unlike people with narcissistic personality, most people would be willing to admit to their faults, actually feel sorry, and then try to change to fix the problem. Covert and overt threats. They will attempt to instill fear in people by threatening them. If you do this, I will do that to you. Such as, if you don't do what I say, I'm going to call the police. Or, you're going to get in trouble. Or, worse off, I'll run you over with my car. You better do what I say. In hopes that you'll submit to their demands. This is a form of control. Often, if you call their bluff, they will get infuriated even more. There is no real plan to compromise. Name calling. They target their victims to seek to undermine their credibility and intelligence in any way possible. They'll often tell you what they want you to believe, such as, you're the one that's crazy and unstable. When faced with these kind of abuse, people start to state they will not tolerate it anymore. They don't internalize the statements, and this kind of abuse leads to the next kind, the smear campaign. They will use slander to control how others see the victim. The smear campaign is the preemptive strike to sabotage the reputation and cut all support networks in case you try to reach out to them in preparation for the discard phase. Devaluing. They take all the victim's accomplishments and downplay them. They will also try to sabotage any further goals and accomplishments. This is a very effective tactic to isolate the victim from support networks like family, friends, schools, and other authorities in the city you live in. Like most of the tactics already listed, this one uses diversionary tactics in order to establish control over the victim's life. Triangulation. This is when they bring in the opinions, perspective, and suggestive threats of other people into the dynamics. They use the opinion and support to validate their own abuse and behaviors. This is also used to invalidate and discredit the victim while validating their own point of view. Baiting. Similar to moving the goalposts, they bait their victim into traps they control. And when they spring the trap, they will use the victim's reaction of confusion, anger, and distress against them. And again, furthering that the victim is crazy, irrational, and is actually the one that's being abusive. Condescending sarcasm or patronizing. Narcissists use this kind of sarcasm to chronically manipulate and degrade their victims. This makes them feel like they're being treated like a child for constantly being challenged for expressing themselves. This leads to hypervigilance or sensitivity about voicing your own thoughts and opinions for the fear of being reprimanded or punished. This kind of self-censorship is meant to silence the victim. And again, it's very effective against children. Hovering and boundary testing. Abusers tend to hover over their victims. This is backed with promises, fake remorse, and empty words to draw the victim back in and keep them close. They will test your boundaries to see which ones they can cross. Survivors of narcissistic abuse, emotional or physical abuse, often experience more severe effects each time the abuse happens, and every time they get in contact with a person with narcissistic. It's pretty much a downward spiral. Now, to anybody that goes through this, setting healthy boundaries is key to your healing to get through this. You got to start sticking up for yourself and voicing your opinion. Don't worry about what they're going to say or do to you. The abuser will continue to push the boundaries by pushing the emotional reset button, and with each attack causes additional trauma. They use this tactics as a way to punish their victim for standing up for the abuse and for also going back to it. This is why survivors are best told the best way to deal with somebody with NPD is to go no contact. This literally becomes impossible when kids are involved, though. They will use this fact against their spouse and will continue to make things only worse for them if they try to separate from the abuser and the family. Shaming. It is used to destroy and belittle away the victim's self-esteem. If the victim is proud of something, the abuser will find a way of battling and belittling, shaming and downplaying the victim for all the traits or accomplishments they have. This serves to diminish their sense of self and to stifle any pride they may have. Alternatively, if you have any flaws, the narcissist enjoys using those against the victim. He will seek to exacerbate or make them worse instead of trying to heal them. Stonewalling. Now, I'm pretty sure a lot of people knows this one. Stonewalling is whenever they delay or block the request for communication by refusing to answer questions or giving evasive replies. In the case of narcissistic abuse, they usually tend to draw from the conversation or discuss and refuse to address any sort of concerns or the person's concerns. They don't make them feel like a bad person, I guess. You're not allowed to have thoughts and feelings of your own. This results in the victim becoming increasingly demanding of the response, which further conflicts in the relationship. They will use this to try to silence the victim and instill a persistent sense of self-doubt. The abuser is also able to maintain control, they feel, as they continue to pull the strings of the victim like a puppet master. Key points to understand about stonewalling and why they use it. They use it to control. They use it to intimidate. It's meant to belittle or demean the victim into feeling insignificant and unheard. To provoke a reaction that you will do whatever they ask to get back into their favor, or they'll use it against you. AKA, you're harassing me. You're angry and control. You only want to fight, and I only act this way to avoid conflict. Control. Overall, people with narcissistic personality love to maintain control by any means possible. They will isolate the victim, toy with emotion, manufacture situations of conflict out of thin air to keep the victims feeling off-centered. The more power they have over the victim's emotions, the more likely the victim will trust the narcissistic's reality, and they will start to doubt their own intuition and truth about the abuse. They are not concerned with who they hurt, damage, or destroy while maintaining this control. It's really unfathomable how far they'll actually go. Now we covered some of the basics of what narcissistic personality is, narcissistic abuse, and some of the tactics they use to control, manipulate, and cause instability in their targets. I would like to turn to my final point, the effects that it can have closest to them, their family, and more specifically, their spouse and their children. The effects of narcissistic abuse can have potentially crippling lifelong effects that include a cluster of symptoms known as narcissistic victim syndrome. If the victim seeks counseling, they usually end up wondering why the person that claimed to love them is treating them the way they do. They're often feeling confused and they don't get it. And they don't understand why they refuse to communicate and generally don't understand or get the narcissist and their behavior. Sensitive or empathic people just don't understand why they are not receiving the care, the understanding, and the love that they so readily give everyone else. The victim also complains about not feeling loved, why things can't be fixed despite their best efforts to fix it, and that their partner seems cold and heartless. They will usually exhibit emotional instability, anger, confusion, and symptoms of depression, among other problems. Here's a list of some other problems victims will show and talk about. Victims tend to suffer from intrusive thoughts or memories or flashbacks of the abuse. Physical emotional reaction to reminders of the trauma. Nightmares and daymares are flashbacks that make them relive the events as if it's happening all over again. They avoid people and situations associated with the trauma. Negative thoughts of themselves and self-talk, difficulty concentrating and sleeping. This is only a short list of some of the problems survivors have to deal with, and I'd like to go over some other ones in more detail. They develop a persuasive sense of mistrust. The survivor begins distrusting other people and becomes anxious of the intentions of others. Due to the gaslighting, they usually have troubles even trusting their own thoughts, so they begin to question everything. Alongside the tactics the abuser uses to isolate the victim may start to isolate themselves due to the mistrust and the shame that they are feeling. And due to the victim's reminiscing or thinking over the abuse and hearing the abuser's voice in their head and their mind, this only amplifies the victim's negative self-talk and the tendency for self-sabotage. They may sabotage their own goals and dreams and academic pursuits due to the continued and recurring exposure to the trauma and abusers. The last symptom I'm going to cover is the suicidal ideation or self-harming behaviors. Along with the anxiety and depression that comes along with a sense of hopelessness, the survivor's circumstances feel unavailable, as if they can't escape. The victims of intimate partner abuse are twice as likely to attempt suicide attempts. Essentially, the abuser is committing murder without a trace. At this time, I'd like to rejoke its effects on how it affects children. Keep in mind, it is only a glance of some of the effects, and that it's hard to translate or understand without being the one who's experienced it or close enough to perceive and understand it. Children of narcissistic parents. They tend to have chronic self-blame. Narcissistic parents may or may not be openly abusive, but understand. Most of them are certainly emotionally tone-deaf and too preoccupied with their own concerns to hear our pain. Emotionally sensitive children who long to be loved tend to sacrifice self-esteem in a way to cope with this. I should have been a better kid. They start to chronically blame themselves for the way things are. Sensitive kids may become compulsively selfless caretakers by providing others with a warm and caring that they never enjoyed. Children who are adventurous may respond to the narcissistic parent by abandoning trust for other people. They feel everyone will and do treat them with the same cold, distant behavior of that parent. A child who is a gifted empath will develop a laser-like focus on the parents by closely minding to every desire and whim. All in all, the frightened child turns into a little adult and often has to grow up worrying endlessly about their own selfishness. Prospective kids will notice the lack of empathy and remorse, the neglect, the selfishness, and the broken promises and empty words of the narcissistic parent.